What's up guys, it's Brad from LightArchitect. In this video, I'm going to be doing a 3D scene and compositing walkthrough of this car fire shot that we have created inside of Blender. As usual, this scene walkthrough is not really a tutorial, but will hopefully share some concepts and techniques that you can use in your own Blender visual effects projects. Anyways guys, let's get started. Here we are inside of Blender. The first thing that I did for this shot was track our footage here. So as you can see, I just have our live action shot and I've tracked some points here in the foreground on this column, as well as some points in the background to tell Blender the general camera move of our live action camera so that it can recreate that data in the 3D world. If you don't know what 3D camera tracking is, I do have a tutorial on this process, so I'll put a link to that in the description below. So I've tracked our footage here, and as you can see, I have a solve error of 1.37 up here in the top right, and under 2 is pretty good for an HD sequence. So after doing this, I got into Blender and started laying out my 3D scene and the things that I wanted to add to it. So here we are inside of layout mode, and as you can see, if I just play through my scene, I just have a very basic layout here. I have a few different view layers in our scene, and I'll just go through them one by one. I have our wreckage, which contains our car scan as well as the CG pillar here in the foreground. I have a shadow catcher that will catch the shadows for our composite so that we can composite those shadows of our CG elements separately onto our footage. Then I have a view layer for our 2D atmospheres that we've added with our atmospheric add-on. Then I have a fire simulation, which I'll cover in a second, some sparks, and then I've also added some ivy here on this view layer to create a more derelict feel. So to start off, I'll show you guys our wreckage view layer here. I've just imported this 3D car scan from sketchfab.com, and it's really cool to use 3D scans in live action because all that real life texture detail is baked onto the material. So it's a really great way to streamline a realistic CG element that you're adding to the scene, as long as you don't need really clean topology to do some kind of simulation with. So I just have this CG car that I've added to our scene, and then I've also grabbed a CG pillar here, which I've used to replace the live action pillar in the foreground. So as you can see here, if I go to camera view, I've just added our pillar and then our car in the background. I've also recreated the general geometry of our scene with these planes here to recreate the parking garage geometry. And I've also projected a still frame of our parking garage on these planes as well, so that we could use that lighting from the camera projection of our parking garage to light our car here. So as you can see here, if we go into rendered view, this is what our view layer with our CG elements looks like. To recreate the lighting of our scene, again, I've created a camera projection of our environment, and I'll just turn off their shadow catcher status here for a second to show you guys how we're actually lighting our CG renders. You can see I've just kind of projected our live action environment onto these planes that are reconstructing our parking garage, and these are all emission materials so that they're actually emitting light, so they'll actually help light our CG car here in the foreground. In addition to this, I also took into account some of the fluorescent light tubes in our live action shot. So because, as you can see here on the top left of frame, we have a fluorescent light tube in the parking garage, I've also created this area light to help emulate that. So as you can see, if I go and turn this off, you'll notice that this light is actually lighting our car here, emulating that fluorescent, which helps, in my opinion, really bring it into the scene. As you guys know, one of the biggest concepts I mentioned when it comes to creating realistic CG and live action composites is having correct lighting on that CG element that matches your live action shot. So that's what I wanted to do with this area light here. And then I have another one here in the background, as you can see here, that's simulating another light source in our scene that creates this edge around the car here. So you can see if I turn those off, we have a much darker version of the car, but as soon as we turn those on, it comes to life and fits in our environment much better based on that fluorescent lighting that was already in the live action parking garage. In addition to the area light, as well as our camera projection of the environment projected onto that geometry, I also have a very basic HDRI to create some ambience in the scene of a city environment that just helps to bring everything together. As far as this view layer goes, I turned off all of our other elements in the scene so that I could render out our car as well as our CG pillar here in the foreground on this view layer in order to create an effective composite so that we could tweak all of our separate elements later. However, the lights in the scene are added to all of our different view layers so that all of our different CG elements that are added are lit in the exact same way. The next thing that I added to the scene was some ivy growing around our car here. I wanted to make kind of an overgrown derelict feel for the shot, kind of like the Last of Us TV show where there's lots of vine overgrowth. So as you can see here, if I go to our view layer called ivy, we can see that very clearly. You can see we have a general geometry recreation of our car here, but then I've added these vines here, and I've just used the GeoFX add-on that we have available on Blender Market to draw our ivy system into our scene, and then I've adjusted the parameters here accordingly. So you can see here we just created this nice nice overgrowth, and I've just made this Vine Systems collision collection be the shadow catchers, which is these 3 planes right here, which means that based on where I'm drawing this ivy, it's going to attach itself to the 3D geometry recreation. So as you can see here, this ivy is kind of sticking to the top of our parking garage as well as the back wall here. So that's a little system that we've added to our scene. And to give you guys an example of how this works, I'll go ahead and go into edit mode and delete all of our system here. And we can start from scratch. We can literally just go into draw mode here with our ivy system selected, and then we can kind of draw where we want the ivy to show up. So I've just done this and I've tweaked it quite a bit. Tried to draw some on the back wall and the roof here. So I kind of like do this and it'll grow on the roof, and then maybe we can have it come down like so to create some kind of overgrowth and create something that's a little bit more interesting. And you can be really precise with this. You can draw only on surfaces, for example, to create a more derelict looking result. So we can really go crazy with this here and literally just draw on ivy systems where we want them to be. You know, we can just really have fun with it here. Maybe draw some by the car. And yeah, here we go. Now if we go into viewpoint camera, you can see that just like that, we've recreated another ivy system. So that's what we've done there. As you can see on this view layer, if we go into rendered view, you'll notice that we're only rendering the ivy system on this view layer. And that again is so we can composite all of these different elements separately. You can see that our wreckage view layer with the car, as well as our pillar here in the foreground, is enabled as a holdout, so that any vines behind those 3D elements are hidden based on their perspective from the camera when the car or the pillar are in front of them. And as you can see here, if I turn that off as a holdout, now we see our car and our pillar in its entirety. But then when we turn that back on, it hides those vines accordingly. So you can see here, we're not seeing those vines behind our pillar here, even though, as you can see, it exists here in the foreground. And that's really how holdouts are meant to be used, so that you can very easily mask out your CG elements on different view layers. Anyways, after adding the ivy system to the scene with GeoFX, I wanted to add a fire simulation of the car burning. And this was one of the more tedious aspects of this project. As you can see here, if we go into our fire sim view layer, I have a very basic domain cube, and this contains our fire simulation. I'll go ahead and turn it on here so you guys can see more clearly. So this is our fire simulation. It plays back kind of slowly here, but this is the general look of it. I thought it was a pretty nice result. I have our resolution divisions at 96, and I've experimented with those. Generally, the higher the resolution divisions, the larger in scale that smoke simulation is going to look. And then based on how much more detail you want in that fire, you can then increase your noise upres factor accordingly. So I have a pretty nice looking simulation there, and I've brought down the reaction speed a bit to get a little bit more flames in our simulation. And I've also played around with these settings a bit, for example, to make our smoke dissolve over 80 frames, and then played around with the vorticity of the simulation as well. And with my first test of this fire simulation on the car, I was getting this really smooth, low vorticity fire, and then when I would crank up the vorticity on the fire and smoke in the domain settings, I didn't really get an effect that I wanted. So what I ended up doing was using a variety of different turbulence and wind force fields. So you can see here, go ahead and turn off some of our elements here so we can see them by itself. So you can see I have 3 different force fields affecting our fire simulation here. The first one that I added was this turbulence force field, and I just have a strength of 30, which is pretty high, and a size of 1, which is just going to break up the smoke on a fairly large scale level according to the scale in the scene. How I look at this is 1 meter. So it'll break up the fire and smoke with a 1 meter pattern. So you can see this is around 1 meter, essentially 1 grid pattern in our scene. So fairly large scale turbulence on our smoke and fire here. But one of the biggest things that I found helped to make a better looking simulation in this case was actually creating a maximum distance for this turbulence to work. So you can see if I just deselect this checkbox, you can see that around our turbulence field, we're actually limiting where that turbulence is going to show up in our simulation. And by enabling this, we can tell Blender only have the turbulence in this area and then leave the rest of the simulation alone. And in my opinion, limiting where this turbulence affects is one of the best ways to create a more realistic looking simulation, because if you turn this off, all of a sudden the turbulence is going to affect this entire domain equally, and you end up getting some results where the smoke and fire just goes everywhere, and you end up doing a lot more iterations of the effect that don't make a lot of sense. So I found that maximum distance really helps to create a lot of turbulence where the fire is, and then let the smoke fall off and burn off more naturally with these other effects based on the rest of your smoke settings. I also have a little vortex force field to spin the smoke, and again I've used that max distance parameter on that so that this is kind of spinning the smoke as it reaches up here, and then I've added a wind force field just to get it in the general direction that I wanted. Also, if you aren't familiar with smoke simulation, in order to emit the actual fire, you actually need an inflow object, and that is what this cylinder here is. First, I've created the smoke domain where the simulation resides within. That's why it's cut off here once the smoke reaches the edge of the box. And then, of course, in addition to the domain, you need something that is burning within your scene, which is this flow object that I have selected here. So as you can see here, it's just a very basic cylinder that I've created as an inflow object, which is slowly burning throughout our scene. So that's how I've created our fire simulation. For our fire simulation view layer, I also have our car and column collection here labeled as a holdout so that anything that the car is in front of is not being rendered. So as you can see here, if we go to render it separately, you'll notice that that car geometry is cutting off where it intersects with the fire, so that we have a much more realistic way to overlay our fire system and add our various effects to it separately without having to do a lot of manual cleanup and compositing with rotoscoping techniques. That holdout of the car just helps us to blend it into the scene much better in the compositing process. And as you can see, we have some pretty nice looking detail in this smoke and fire, even though we didn't really crank up the resolution divisions that much. Anyways, after creating this cool fire simulation, I wanted to add some sparks to bring it into the scene even more. So as you can see here on our next view layer, we've labeled it sparks, and I've just added a very basic spark particle system to emit from a similar kind of cylinder shape where our fire would be in our 3D world. And I'll go ahead and turn off our environment and shadow catcher layer. And you can see if I go to the particle system settings, I have 25,000 particles and lots of scale randomness. I have a very small velocity with not a lot of randomness. I just wanted them to be slowly moving sparks as our car burned in the scene. And you can see here, if I play through our scene, we're actually getting some really nice turbulence on our spark particles. That is from our same turbulence force field that we have used to shape our fire simulation. So by having that turbulence force field as well as the wind, we can create a much nicer and more random looking spark simulation that fits into our scene much better. And on our spark particle system, I just have a very basic icosphere instance over and over again. Since the sparks are so small, we don't really need anything complex. And I just have that icosphere as a emission material. So that's just emitting this orange glow. So, you know, when we zoom out, they're just very small particles that are being emitted right where that fire system is. And in my opinion, it was a pretty nice looking result. Of course, you can tweak a lot of things. You could make the particles get smaller over time, but I found that this result was looking pretty good, so I went with it. On this view layer, again, I have our car labeled as a holdout, so you can see, again, wherever our car is, it is hiding the spark particles. I don't know if you can tell, but it's just quick holdout collection so that we can composite these sparks on top of our burning car with a lot more ease. So finally, after adding our fire and smoke view layers to bring our simulation to life, I wanted to add some more haze elements on top of our composite, but I wanted to do this in 3D space. So as you can see here, if I go to our atmospheres view layer, we have a whole bunch of different planes that I've added into our scene. And these planes are just basic 2D smoke elements that are from our atmospheric smoke elements add-on. And I believe I've used some of the lingering fog collection here, which is kind of some slow moving smoke elements, and I've just imported those into our scene. And as you can see, if I go into rendered view, we just get 4 smoke elements, 3 of which are the exact same one. The 4th is a little bit different here, but I've just layered these in 3D space in front of our camera. And then as our 3D camera moves around the scene, since these smoke elements are parallel to the camera, they're still really great parallax and they create kind of a 3D look. And using these 2D smoke elements is a really great way you can enhance your 3D scene without increasing computation time. So, you know, you don't have to create an actual simulation every time you need a little bit of haze in your scene. You can just use these live action smoke elements and put them on cards, and as long as your camera isn't moving all the way around them to where, you know, you would see them from a side angle, if you see them from the front and they're moving, you know, side to side here, you can create some really interesting and enhance a lot of realism very quickly in your scene just by layering these different elements into Z space. So that's what I've done here. You can see if I kind of scroll through my scene, we just have these smoke elements that are going to be great when composited on top of everything. And you can see that I've also made our wreckage a holdout, which is why we're getting this hard edge right here. But if we turn that off, we can see our car in its entirety comped in with all of our different smoke elements here. And I find that combining the CG fire simulation with some live action smoke elements like this really helps to build the realism and create a much more organic looking feel. Finally, after adding our atmospheres to the scene, I've just created a very basic shadow catcher view layer layer. And all this is all of our elements enabled as indirect only, and then we're rendering out on our planes here in the background and foreground a shadow pass so that we can then composite our shadows separately. So you can see I have our ivy collection as an indirect only layer, meaning that the ivy will create shadows based on its geometry, but we're not actually rendering the ivy itself. And we also have our car wreckage and pillar collection here enabled as indirect only as well. Again, so it won't actually be rendered in our scene, but that geometry will affect the shadows that are rendered on the shadow catcher planes that we have created in our scene. Anyways guys, those are the 6 view layers that I have created for this shot. After creating all of these elements and separating them into their own view layers, I've rendered them out separately and then got into the compositing process all inside of Blender. Alright guys, here we are inside of the compositor. As you can see, it's a fairly simple node setup here. This is our composite without the final color grade on top of it. As you can see, looking pretty cool here. I'll just go through the various passes that I've overlaid on top of each other in this node compositing tree. So as you can see here, we're starting out with our movie clip with some undistortion in a scale node, and we're overlaying our shadow catcher on top of that. So I'll go ahead and just show you guys with a viewer node real quick what this looks like by itself. So we have our live action shot, then we've overlaid with our shadow catcher view layer our shadow like so. And you can see our shadows are looking pretty deep here. I have our factor at 1, but obviously we could dial this back as well if we wanted a little bit less. And I've also added a little bit of blur to our shadow just to get rid of some of the noise sampling and to blend it into our shot a bit better. Then next I've added our car wreckage view layer on top of everything. So as you can see here, if I overlay this, we've overlaid our car wreckage. As you can see, I have some glare on that as well to create some flaring. Just because some of the lights in our scene had some flaring from our live action shot, I tried to replicate that as well. And you can see I have a variety of different effects on our car here. This is our car wreckage view layer by itself. And then I've blurred it here 2 pixels to make sure it wasn't too sharp compared to the rest of our footage. I've added some RGB curves to it to just dial it in a bit more. And then most noticeably, I added those glare nodes on top of everything. So you can see here, a little bit of glare there, and then a little bit more with this glare node, like so. And that just helps blend everything together. And then I've also desaturated our car with this hue, saturation, and value node to get this final result before overlaying it on top of our footage, just like that. So now we have our car wreckage in addition to our shadow pass. The next layer that I added was our ivy. So as you can see here, we have our ivy pass by itself. I've run it through some blur and RGB curves to dial in the color a bit more. Then I've also added some glare to it just to match it to our car layer. Again, some desaturation on that as well. So you can see with our ivy, we have this. And next I've added our fire simulation on top of everything with all of these nodes. And you can see a little bit of sampling on our fire. It's not perfect, but once we've added those sparks and that final grade on top of everything, in addition to those atmospheres, which you'll see here in a second, it helps blend everything together fairly nicely. So you can see here we have our fire with its holdout from the car. I've added a variety of color correction tools here. So we have some curves and some glare. The glare really helps blend in the fire into the scene a bit, especially this last one, I think. And again, some hue and saturation as well, because it was a little bit too orange for me. So I just dialed it back a bit, and then overlaying that on top of the rest of our composite with the alpha over node. And then next, of course, we added our sparks on top of our fire. So you can see here, we've overlaid our spark system on top of everything. And you can see I've added some glare to those sparks to make them a little bit more bright in our scene. There's our spark view layer by itself, and then we've added some glare to those sparks like so, and then finally overlaid them on our image. So now we have our sparks on top of everything, which is helping to make it a little bit more chaotic. And then finally, we've added our atmospheres view layer on top of everything. So we're taking this view layer right here, and then I've added a little bit of blur on top of that just to help blend it into the scene a bit better. And you can see the holdout from our pillar working nicely on these atmospheres here to help blend it into the scene. I've also added some RGB curves on top of our atmospheres to just give it a little bit more contrast, make it a little bit more punchy in the scene. And then finally, we've overlaid that on top of the rest of the composite with our alpha overnode. I only have this alpha overnode at 0.56, so dialing back those atmospheres by around half. You can see if I can dial this up, we can get a much heavier haze, as you can see there. And then if you wanted to boost the contrast on that, it also would look pretty nice and honestly maybe a little bit more realistic, but I wanted to really draw more attention to the simulation here in the background, so I decided to go with a slightly less smoky look. And yeah, after that I added a basic color grade. I actually did the final color grade inside of Adobe Premiere. I added a Fujifilm LUT because I tend to like that Fujifilm look, and that's how I got my final result. Anyways guys, that's it for this video. I hope it was helpful. As always, feel free to leave a comment if you have any questions or suggestions in the comment section below. Subscribe if you're interested in more visual effects and filmmaking content, and I'll see you in the next video.